This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
What's the gender bill all about? What's the deal? As always, the OI podcast is here with the unbiased facts. Our policy is to ask an expert. Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, weekly conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mātauranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch for the Royal Society of Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, nau mai, haere mai. For those of you new to the OI podcast, welcome. I'm Dr Barb, a quantitative ecologist with a background in modelling, climate change, biodiversity, conservation prioritisation, SciComm, and a PhD in botany from Ōtākau Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago. Today's show is Transgender Communities and the Gender Bill with Dr Jaimie Veale. This conversation was recorded on Wednesday, the 23rd of June 2026. Dr Veale is a Rutherford Discovery Fellow and Senior Lecturer at the School of Psychology, University of Waikato. She holds a PhD from Massy University, is the Director of the Transgender Health Research Lab, home of the Counting Ourselves project, the first comprehensive national survey of transgender and non-binary people's health and wellbeing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Her research program focuses on improving health outcomes for transgender communities through rigorous community-engaged and policy-relevant scholarship. The aims of her work are to, and there are 5 of these, advance understanding of health inequities experienced by transgender populations, identify the social and structural determinants that drive these inequities, 3, generate high-quality evidence to inform policy and clinical practice. 4, build capacity for community-informed research that centres lived experience alongside methodological rigour. And 5, develop interdisciplinary approaches to gender and sexuality diversity that integrate biological, psychological and social scientific perspectives. Dr Veale's work contributes to advancing both the scientific foundations of transgender health research and the translation of evidence into meaningful improvements in policy, healthcare and community wellbeing. Wow, that is a lot. Thank you so much for coming along today, Dr Jaimie Veale. Now, am I saying that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And Jaimie, just calling me Jaimie's fine.
Excellent. The Veale with the Veale on the end. Yeah. I was like, yes. Do I pronounce that?
Yeah, a lot of my Pacifica friends are like, is that Veale? But no, it's Veale. It's
just Veale.
Yeah. Yes, from somewhere on the British Isles originally. From the meat, yeah.
Yes. Hey, thank you so much for coming along today. And it's super topical because, of course, here in Dunedin, we've just, and I guess in other places across the Motu as well, we've just had the gender, the kind of march. I don't know if it was really a protest. It was a protest against the bill, obviously, but it was kind of reaffirming of our commitment to the community that is all our community as well. So, and it was here at least, it was quite I would say quite a joyful kind of a gathering, really, with the waiata and the kind of it was a very positive kind of obviously very set against the bill, but also a very positive kind of reaffirmation of kind of love for the community. So
yeah, that's lovely to hear. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it. I heard similar positive things about the ones, in our part of the Motu, Kirikiriroa Hamilton, and also, a lot of connections in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. But I think that's important too. Like, I think, having what's the counter to a lot of what's going on and what's the other side of it is so important. Then, getting too stuck in, what's being said in terms of some of the specifics, which I'm sure we'll get into as well. But I think there is an important other side, which you're mentioning there, which is important.
Yeah, no, it's good to see the positivity around and the kind of general acceptance and the just kind of like this. I don't know. I think for a lot of people, there's quite a lot of bewilderment about this bill, as in why? Why is this coming up now? Why is it needed? Is it needed? What's the point? Why even is this a thing? It seems I think for a lot of people, it's just like, I don't get it. Why are we even talking about this? Like, it seems like it was something that was settled and we've kind of moved on from that, and now for some reason it's kind of been brought up again, and it does sort of seem like, isn't this something that we're past this? I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, okay. Yes, no, that's a whole, why it's coming up. We could speak for an hour probably. I guess the short thing is, there is some, definitely waves of movements that particularly seems like, and I'm not an expert on where this all kind of comes from originally, but it seems like originating mostly from places like the UK and the US, is really pushing a very different message, and a very, I think, very divisive message. And also, a different context there perhaps than what we have here, in terms of, like, a lot of the media is really pushing a lot of anti-trans messages. So in a lot of those contexts, some of these ways of thinking about things probably, I'd be happy to talk more about this, probably don't seem as surprising in some of those contexts. Yeah. Whereas we've been a little bit more perhaps sheltered and isolated from some of those messages. A lot of those, some of those are even in mainstream media, but then there's also some of the messages coming in social media as well. And so, yes, so I'm sure for many people, probably many of the listeners are like, where the heck is this coming? Is this actually such an important women's rights issues? We were talking about pay equity and, other things which you would think have meaningful impacts on many women's lives, but then here instead we're being asked to talk about these other things which, probably many hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of the, and we will come back to that, but I guess for me, it seems that the legislation is, I guess it's setting out for definitions. Legislation, and then in brackets, this is directly from the website, definitions of woman and man amendment bill. Now, this is open for submissions, and the closing date for those submissions are 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, the 2nd of July, 2026. So that's coming up. And what I would say is, don't leave it to the last minute. It is open right up until 11:59 p.m. But historically, those websites have crashed with people submitting right at the last moment. So if you want to make a submission, submitted is better than perfect is the saying there, and you can tick the box to say you'd like to speak in person. The little blurb that goes with it says, and this again is a quote directly from the website, the bill would amend the Legislation Act 2019 by adding a definition of woman as an adult human biological female, and of man as an adult human biological male, with corresponding definitions for male and female. According to the bill's general policy statement, the purpose of this amendment is to uphold legal certainty, protect the integrity of sex-based rights, and ensure that language in law reflects biological reality. This definition will apply in all contexts where the terms woman and man are used, unless explicitly stated otherwise in specific legislation. Yeah, I'm just going to throw that to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, sure. I guess I will start by saying I went on to check the website earlier, and it took about 5 minutes to load. So definitely, I wouldn't be surprised if it does crash at the last minute. So I absolutely agree with that. I guess I think a really important place to start is, I think, it's saying that these definitions are needed, you said, to protect sex-based rights and spaces.
I didn't say that. The legislation. No. That was a direct quote there.
So the legislation says that. Sorry, yeah. Yes. Clarify that.
Just to clarify.
But, there's actually, you would think good legislation should be evidence-based, right? And, that's something that's, this podcast, you said in your intro is really all about. There's no evidence demonstrating that there's any widespread problems in Aotearoa, and that any, progress for trans people's legal recognition has undermined things like women's safety or participation or women's rights in any ways. So really, you would expect a bill to kind of establish that there's some kind of problem that exists.
That there's some need for the bill in the first place.
Some need for it.
Yeah.
And that this actually a solution. This actually provides a solution. But I don't think the bill does either of those things.
I think that one of the problems is, this is just kind of the summary of the bill, right? So this is just like what's on the site, but it kind of lends itself to exactly what I think a lot of people see as one of the main problems with this bill, is that the definition of a woman as an adult human biological female gets you no further. Like, it's kind of like, okay, so then you have to define an adult human biological female. And you would think that you would be doing that based on, I don't know, evidence, biological, scientific. And it's not quite that simple.
Not that simple. And I'm great we have you as an ecologist. You identify yourself as that. I know you talked about your background in that biological expertise as well. So, we can even get into some of these nuts and bolts if that's something that you're interested in too, which is something which, I think is quite, could be a helpful perspectives to get out to wider audiences too. Yeah, absolutely. There's much more complexity in terms of like when we think about humans in terms of complexity in not just our genders, as in terms of like how the roles we live in, how we understand ourselves and the bodies we live in. As men, women, males, females, we have non-binary people, we have intersex people who, completely missed by things like this bill. And so they're interesting, like, getting into some of the biology and evolution and all these things, which we can get into. But, the reality is, this is something that's going to be about law and policies in New Zealand. So, just reducing it just to biology and saying that that's the essential part and that's all that counts, isn't missing. It's missing important part of the picture, and it's not acknowledging the diversity that genuinely exists within humans. In our gender and also in the ways that our bodies are.
Yeah, and I guess I've heard the discussion behind the difference between gender and sexuality as being who you are versus who you want to have sex with. And I guess there's kind of a little bit of that in here as well with like, it seems to be all about identity in who you are, but I also kind of feel like, I don't know, at some point I don't really care. Like, you are who you are, whatever. Like, isn't that the basis of human rights in a way, is that people are who they are? I don't really care. If you want to identify as non-binary or as female or as male or as a parrot, I don't really, just to be weird about it, but
yeah.
It doesn't affect me, right? So I don't see what, and I kind of, that's where I kind of get stuck with this legislation, that it's kind of like it's actively harming some people in the community. And yes, I think we can say that because, it doesn't matter if you think that non-binary people or intersex people are a very small proportion of the community. They're still part of the community. And I think there's a lot of perception of people being a smaller part of the community than perhaps they are because of the way that community has treated people who are somehow different or other for, through history, really. But I guess, where's my point here? My point is that, is there a need for the legislation? If that hasn't been actually kind of evidence that there's a need for this legislation, if it's a legislation that's kind of poorly written because it's kind of circular in its describing of things. But then if it's also actively harming a group of people from our community but not benefiting anyone, then that kind of seems like a good place.
Not good legislation.
Not good legislation. Yeah, so I think apart from what actually the legislation is about, it's actually just an example of not good legislation.
Yes, well, I'm not an expert on what makes good legislation, but yeah, like I said,
well, neither am I, to be fair. Yeah,
there should be evidence of a problem, and that good understanding that the bill is going to address the problem. And like I said, I don't think, like you say, where are we seeing this actual evidence of a problem? It needs to be fixed, and I could also say as well, so I talked about in my previous response about non-binary and intersex people that wouldn't fit within these binary definitions of sex and gender, but we also have binary trans people. So there's a trans woman or trans men, but who wouldn't be who would be I guess excluded or wouldn't be as part of these definitions, wouldn't meet their gender if the bill goes through, just defining based on what I would guess how it would be interpreted with although it remains a little unclear, but with what they say of biological sex. So there's that too. And I think going back to, I guess, some of the more basic definitions, like what you were saying, yes, you have a good way to think about it is you have your sex characteristics, which is bimodal, but there is still overlap, and you have people with variations of sex characteristics who don't completely meet typical what we see as male typical or female typical sex characteristics. And then you have still bimodal, but perhaps less bimodal, I suppose, genders and sexualities. And then gender is can be man, woman. Non-binary is the most common, I guess, other gender that's not man or woman, I suppose. And then sexuality as well. And these things are, it is helpful to think of them as separate in terms of you can have one gender and a sex that shouldn't define your sexuality necessarily. So, if you identify as a man, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be attracted to women. But also there's this complexity there as well, and these things are all intertwined. They're part of the same, probably the same, human sex gender system, and I think that's part of probably why actually our genders are such an important part of the diversity of who we are. It's not that we're it is a bit different from something like identifying as, say, a parrot, like you say, because there's, it's actually gender, which is something that's quite core to who we are, and having that diversity is something that's important to our nature. Having that diversity within the kind of like broader gender ecosystem. So it is a little bit different from perhaps identifying out of some of those other things.
Out of species, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. It's not to say that that's a whole other topic. People's other identities and how much we connect with other aspects of things out there in the world. But I think there is something important to our to who we are as a species in terms of sorry, go on.
I guess there's some parallels to be had with ethnicity and culture. So you can sort of, you could, like my forefathers on my father's side are from the Shetland Islands. So in some ways I identify a little bit as having come from the Shetland Islands. But, really my main identity is a Kiwi, but I don't really identify as being a Kiwi from Auckland, because I'm very much a South Island-based Kiwi. So there's kind of, even within kind of culture and ethnicity, there's kind of layers to it, and there's gradients and slants and kind of, I mean, I guess I can't think of much that there isn't. That kind of, like, I think the more you look at things, the less things are discrete in their categories. And I think biology is the same as that. You know, we have, I think the biology, like just from a pure science biology point of view, that we have an understanding of hormones and cells and all the things that go with biology, which is a massive field in itself. Even that has just progressed so much in the last couple of 100 years that outdated definitions don't really, and also very cultured definitions. And I think there's some sort of discussion to be had about not just that bimodal that you were talking about genders, but also kind of the layer. It's not really, it's the layer that society puts upon that as well. Like Western women, at some stage, it was very manly to not be wearing a dress, right? So you would be, I mean, that would be like crazy. Like literally, you'd be locked up as a crazy person, sent to it because you were, you know, wearing men's clothes. And yet in some cultures, like a tunic type garment is perfectly normal for everybody to be wearing. So I think there's quite a lot of social overlay in it.
Absolutely. And yes, you can look back at how we've, you know, even in Aotearoa, how we've, understood ethnicity and, you know, different ways of thinking through things in terms of, like, you know, we no longer talk about like the quantum of, you know, the percentage of blood that we have, and there's much more, you know, understanding of, you know, the lived experience that we have, like you talked about, and the
kind of the multifaceted part of an identity that we have in all sorts of realms. I guess.
The social elements of it too. Yeah, absolutely.
And
and with genders as well, just to, I guess, round out the kind of like ways of thinking about these things as well. I think it's important concept is too to be thinking through, like when we're thinking about men and women, we have trans men and trans women, and we have cis men and cis women. So, you know, these are all groups that identify as men and women, but trans people come from that background and lived experience, which is different from cisgender people whose experiences of their gender aligned with what was the society's expectation based on their sex characteristics as they were raised and as they grew up too.
I was just going to say that if you could throw out for those listeners that are unfamiliar with the term cis, CIS, cis woman, cis man, cisgendered. Yeah, but then you already supplied that. It's kind of like
yes. Yeah, and that's I think goes back to the Latin of we had the word trans for quite a long while before. People were like, hey, actually we need terms for those who are non-trans, and then so the word cis got used. And
I mean, we're quite lucky in English that we largely dropped the genderizing of language. In terms of tables and chairs don't have genders anymore. The moon doesn't have a gender. You know, Latin, Italian, French, German, Spanish all have a gender that goes with everything. But we have retained it for some things, like people and animals. Like my dogs are she's, they're not he's. And weirdly also boats and cars. I'm just trying to think. I can't think of any other inanimate objects, but they're out there. But there's certain weird things. But just and I've heard a lot of people have this this discussion about about pronouns: she, her, they, them, he, his. Gosh, I'm getting scratching my head here a little bit. It's crazy. is it? And I guess there's been kind of talk about having additional pronouns added, but also we could just get rid of all of the pronouns and just use they, them for everyone.
Yeah, yes, and maybe that's the way where we'll go. Who knows where language will evolve? I think the important thing with pronouns is, it's not a new trans thing, which people, some of the opposition to it, perhaps frame it as something that's, something that trans people have come up with. But no, actually, like you say, it's something that we all use. And, we did come from a time perhaps where people use their titles a lot more. And so if you were reviewing someone, like I've been looking at some job applications before, you might be able to say, what pronouns that you use for that person based on their title. But we don't really have titles as much. So pronouns has come up as an alternative for when you don't know necessarily what language to use for that person. So, in terms of where we go, there are other languages like Te Reo Māori and many others that don't have gendered pronouns. And they is becoming much more common, and counting ourselves being I think you mentioned the Aotearoa New Zealand Trans Health Survey, the largest national survey that we've had. More of our participants, over 50% were non-binary, and so probably the most common pronouns used by non-binary people are they, etc. pronouns too. It's not perfect because people get a bit confused if you're talking about the number of people who you're talking about. But we are increasingly seeing the singular they being used.
But there is
language.
I was just going to say, but there is press. I mean, people always say, "Oh no, it's confusing. I don't know how many people I'm talking about." I have heard that, I must say, in conversation. But if someone left their jersey on the bus and you don't know who it was, you do quite often say they will need to pick it up from the office afterwards, right?
Absolutely. And that's not necessarily something new.
It's not something new at all. It's really embedded in the English language already. So it's not that there's a new invention happening here. It's a change.
I mean, it's just easier than saying, in the past we might have said he as a default, like in the,
because everybody is masculine, right? Because that's our default.
That was how it was, I guess, perhaps 50 years ago. And then people, and feminists and rightly will push for that. No, it should be him or her.
But then that's really awkward, right? He, her, could they be?
So then just having one word like they actually makes a lot of sense. And doesn't matter how many people's jersey it was that,
Yeah, could have been the whole team's jersey altogether. Could have been the mascot's jersey.
So it's probably fine. And it would be great if we have a easily agreed upon term. And I think when we're talking about you, you can talk about you as like one person or you as multiple persons. I mean, some people, particularly up here, you hear yous a little bit more, like the plural of you, but. You can have a word which is both singular and plural, and it's fine.
And we don't think anything of it. And of course, thee and thou, right? Thee and thou has disappeared from our language. There's a little bit left in some kind of proverbs. I guess there's thee and thous, and in the Bible and in Shakespeare and things that are kind of archaic language. But thee and thou was the informal for you, and we just kind of decided that we didn't need that. We would just talk to everybody as if they were formal, and we just basically just dropped a whole class of pronoun from everyday English language. So there's precedent for just dropping she and he, so I don't know. In a way, I feel like it would just be simpler.
Yeah, I know, you don't have to think as much.
You don't have to think as much, right? And I think fundamentally...
You don't have to worry about assumptions or... and so, there are, scholars who are probably... And, people actually actively thinking about, the fact that the power that is in the language and the words that we use and, actually giving gender when do you actually need it and how are you actually... reinforcing some kind of
gender stereotype that's there.
By needing to say it. And so we are seeing a lot of people opting out of using gendered terms increasingly.
Well, I was thinking about this the other day after the rally actually. Things like chairman. It used to be a chairman, And then suddenly there was a woman in the position, so they made her a chairwoman. But then lately you don't hear that, right? They're the chair of the meeting, and that's
which is easier to say.
And it doesn't have that loadedness of whether it's a, you know, and the same with Mayor, like Mayor Sophie Barker of Dunedin at the moment. People don't refer to her as the mayoress. Well, they may do, but I haven't heard it. I mean, the person is the mayor, whether they're a male or female. There's no gender needed, and there's lots of
needed for a gender.
Yeah, and we have lots of professions.
But if it was,
sorry, carry on.
No, I was going to say yes. That's interesting that mayor, like we think of it as a non-gendered term, but it is interesting that there used to be a mayoress, so it must have used to have been male gendered, and you see quite a pattern of a lot of words. Gosh, we could geek out about language probably for the whole hour.
Yes.
There's lots of gendered words, like saying things like "you guys," where it turns from being male to being like
to being non-gendered. Yeah,
but I think there is an inherent, you know, the fact that we don't go from being female or for women to being non-gendered shows, you know, quite a I guess an inequity there, or like shows a bias towards it's okay for women to be more like men, but not okay for men to be more like women. So there's some interesting history there. So I tend to try and avoid, you know, words like, you know, you guys to include more expansive ways, and actually thinking, you know, actually how can we create actual more
I find myself saying folk,
inclusive words. Yeah,
which doesn't sort of fit naturally, and it has taken quite probably a couple of years now for it to come naturally to say, instead of saying you guys, to say, hey folks, we're ready for the next bit to start, or, you know, in that sort of context with a kind of an informal group thing. I guess things like mayor and mayoress, you're kind of dropping the diminutive off the end, like there was an added bit like actor and actress.
No,
And so I kind of give them a bit of a break, I guess, because I don't even know what you would call it.
You can't be perfect with anything. Like I don't think there is any.
But it is really true that it's
neutral term for gender or for actor or for mayor or whatever. So we just have to go.
Yeah. But it is amazing how many of our occupations are gendered.
Yeah. And there's some which I think are better, like when you have like firefighter instead of fireman, because there's never been firewoman. So I think firefighter just makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and I guess police officer as well. That sort of makes more sense.
Yeah,
I think there's some that definitely have changed, and I think that's for the better as well. But we could geek out forever on language.
Yeah, and like, another point that you mentioned, Barbara, was the why is this, you know, seeming to come up now? And I think an important, with this, going back to this bill, I think an important thing that we're seeing from what we know and what international scholarship has uncovered is a really common pattern, really recognizable pattern of what some of them have termed like artificial threat construction, like this idea that there's this threat that's going on that means we need to immediately mobilize ourselves to protect the safety of you know, often it's a vulnerable group. So in the case with trans people, it's often think, you know, threats to women's safety and those kind of things coming through. So and not in a kind of like actually we're seeing evidence or any kind of actual reality. Instead it's like the artificial, I guess, this manufactured understanding, and kind of goes hand in hand with, like, often there's some quite dehumanizing references towards a certain group. So like seeing them as kind of less than human in certain ways. And with trans people, that can play out in quite ways of thinking us as like, you know, not, you know, mentally unwell or kind of deluded about their genders or, you know, mentally unstable. And so got along with that, and that can actually feed into us being seen as threats because we're these unstable people, particularly it gets applied to trans women. And so that brings it lowers the kind of moral barriers that people might have by dehumanizing, but then brings this kind of like urgency for it. And then we see things like this popping up. And probably it seems like it's only for, a small fraction of, a certain, perhaps people who are more in certain political circles or certain online spaces. But we are seeing overseas it becoming much more mainstream and bigger, perhaps bigger proportions of people buying into some of these, I guess, what we call socio-cognitive beliefs.
That's a big phrase, isn't it? Socio-cognitive beliefs.
Political ideas, I suppose. These shared political ideas. And that's really what's behind these things rather than any evidence. And actually, when we look at the evidence, which I'd be happy to talk with you about.
I was just going to say.
Actually, it is trans people ourselves who are the ones who are actually facing a lot of harms and a lot of barriers in our societies.
Yeah, and actually one of the reasons that I specifically wanted to do this interview with yourself today is just to answer some of those questions. And I know we haven't got that much time left because we've rambled on, sorry, about language stuff. But I just wanted to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, because there is that thing where there's this kind of frenzy of fear incited, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with echo chambers and social media. But I think behind that there's there's an active group that are politically pushing these ideas out there, and then that gets whipped up, perhaps by people who just haven't thought it through. But I did want to just talk to you very quickly about the relative, because we touched on it with mental health there, and transgender communities do have a history of bigger than or larger than normal mental health issues. And I wanted to address that, because when we're talking, New Zealand as a whole has quite a high suicide rate, which I probably should have put a trigger warning on. But I know it's particularly high in the transgender community. And I wanted to just quickly check, get your input on that. And because I think, it's a flow-on thing, right? Because if you're suddenly being othered by a lot of people, and your identity is not being recognised, then it would be difficult to not have some mental health issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is that feeling like you've been rejected, within society, or not feeling safe. I think having that sense of safety is important for our sense of mental health. And yeah, absolutely, like you say, counting ourselves, we found many multitudes, higher numbers of proportions of psychological distress, and you mentioned suicides and other psychological difficulties as well, unfortunately for our communities too. And so we're seeing a bill that is going to we saw really high barriers to healthcare access. Many participants in our surveys avoiding healthcare because they're worried about being mistreated or discrimination. That's not going to help with the mental health either. And access to housing, support services, identity documents, all these things. It's
just going to be substantially more difficult,
and discrimination too. And trans participants were much more likely to have experienced discrimination, and we know these things are correlated with mental health and just general well-being. Access to bathrooms, lots of areas in our lives where it's a little unclear, but it seems like this bill could have, and what we are seeing overseas, having creating a lot more barriers and potential harms for our communities. It only seems like that's going to be getting worse. So, I wouldn't be surprised if, we are able to do future counting ourselves ways and unfortunately seeing things going in the wrong direction in terms of our mental health inequities.
Yeah, which is really sad to see. And I guess that's also kind of a consequence of legislation being rushed through and not thought through properly, not designed properly, not, as you say, to address a specific issue, because then you're kind of making just unthought of indirect consequences as well, like, you know, taking the best light on it. Maybe it wasn't, maybe they were just sort of thinking not about alienating transgender folk, but just trying to do something for, what did they say? They said there at the start, didn't they? For women's rights. Although I don't feel how this in any way, as a woman, as a cis woman, I don't feel how this bill in any way protects my rights that weren't already protected. I feel that by kind of saying that there's this identified biological female, it lends me this kind of fear as a cis woman that, am I going to have to prove that I'm biologically female? And who gets to decide that? What we are already seeing is these dehumanising tests that people are having to go through for exactly who's sports, elite sports, and who's the arbiter of that? You know, it's weird to me that this discussion has largely centred, and you touched on this before, has largely centred around trans females, trans women, and women's rights. And you know, in theory, it's about men and like the definition of woman and men. That's what it says at the start. But actually, it's really about women's rights, human rights, and it really seems to go to trans women. And I think that comes to, you know, where the threat construction is kind of sitting in terms of, you know, who are seen as the ones who are, when you have the dehumanizing, and I think there's the kind of understand, like, and we could possibly get into the biology, but, you know, a lot of the opponents to the bill see it as, the proponents of the bill, I should say, have this very reductionist view they just see this binary way. There's two biological sexes, and that's it. That there's nothing more, and they apply it. You know, that's kind of like how that there's no way that anything beyond that can be applied in any different way in our society, despite, you know, evidence to the contrary, or despite, you know, any logic that might say, hey, actually, maybe we need to look at more things like people's bodies or their lived broadly or their lived experiences. They just try and go to the most binary thing that they can get for what. I mean, I guess it's easier to popularise a slogan that is simple and binary. So you're always like that kind of rhetoric tends to go for the lowest common denominator because that gets the cut through a bit more simple. And now I hate to bring this up, but it always seems to go to toilets, and the trouble with toilets. And I guess is that because it's something that feels vulnerable because we're outside of our natural our home environment, but we're in quite a vulnerable situation, or so. I just wanted to I'm really glad you brought it up because you mentioned it. It doesn't feel like it protects you, but actually, and as a cis woman, and actually what we're seeing is many more cis places like the US and the UK, a lot of cis women particularly feeling like they're being policed in places like bathrooms and change rooms, particularly if there's any kind of gender nonconformity in any way that is part of that person's appearance or behaviour or anything really. So that's part of it. And then from a trans perspective as well. Yeah. So I could say as well, we've, in terms of like, I've talked about, lack of evidence of, any problem that needed to be solved in terms of how things had been operating in Aotearoa, in terms of like that this bill might fix. But from the trans perspective, we have really, we actually have evidence, for things like so many of our participants are avoiding public bathrooms, and so we feared problems of arising from being trans and non-binary, not being able to access, because toilets are very often binary. So non-binary people are feeling like obviously having to fit into one or of two binary choices. We had
almost 1 in 5 had experienced verbal harassment in public bathrooms. Quite a few had been stopped from entering bathrooms, and even 3% had been physically attacked. So we had, documented evidence of, some real barriers and some real potential harms from this. And these are the things which are only going to get worse from defining legal categories in ways that excludes us and will make us and cis people have increased scrutiny.
Yeah, and it's kind of a strange area as well, because like a trans woman who presents as female, right, entering into the male bathrooms, signed male bathrooms, surely that would be a very vulnerable state for that person to be in, and kind of odd as well. Yeah, and it's a bit of a mess, to be honest, from what I've read into like experiences overseas trying to actually enact some of these policies, like some kind of requiring things to go based on biology or sex assigned at birth, and then in some other places they were like, oh, you have to have separate, and actually some adding extra requirements for having extra bathrooms for trans people, which is probably never going to go, probably not going to be a lot of funding or a lot of political will for creating these things too. I mean, or just completely get rid of the male-female bathrooms, but then, men would have to wash their hands more. There's real research out there that washing hands in a men's bathroom and in a woman's bathroom is much less frequent in the male bathrooms there. But
not surprised on that one. No, it's interesting. Couple of quick points, and then of course there's trans men as well, which do we want them? They don't want to be in women's bathrooms either. And then in Aotearoa, up until I was at Waiheke Island over summer and saw an old article about. Beaches used to be gender segregated, so because, presumably because, men couldn't control themselves on beaches with women around in various, so I guess maybe this is a time when we should be thinking through, hey, do we actually need gender segregation in our bathrooms? What is it actually, is there a problem that it solves in terms of like, does it really actually protect women, or does it actually reinforce this idea that women need to be protected by being separate, and that men can't control themselves in spaces where women might be peeing behind a cubicle or something like that. Yeah, so perhaps this is a time to be actually having some of these interesting discussions.
And you just think through the premises of why we have this in the first place. And of course there's the whole thing with, with fathers with young daughters, and people saying, well, I wouldn't want a young 3-year-old daughter, or 3 for want to say a word, going into the men's room. And I sort of think, well, if they're not clean enough for a 3-year-old girl, why are they considered clean enough for a 3-year-old boy?
Exactly.
Like there's just this kind of thing. Do we actually just have to take a step back and say, maybe there's a cleanliness issue there, or a perception of cleanliness maybe, but or there's...
And is it actually helpful having these gender segregated bathrooms, or does it create more barriers for families where, the caregiver, or even caregivers with disabled people or others, where there isn't a match with the gender of the caregiver and the person who's needing to go in with them too.
I mean, that's not just with children either. That's the whole diversity of life and the community of caregivers everywhere. And not everyone can use the one separate labelled as family or whatever bathroom. Maybe we should actually just be rethinking how we have bathrooms as a society. And, it reflects what we have at home. Like in our family house, we don't have a men's bathroom and a woman's bathroom, do we? We have a family bathroom.
Absolutely. And, it's about the, and actually coming to a shared understanding of what are the things, people probably want the privacy to, not be in any state of undress where anyone can see anything. But, if you can make that part happen, is there any reason why we need to be washing our hands separately?
And have larger cubicles or changing cubicles. Hey, I am so sorry, but we have 1 minute left to go. Last thoughts on your 1 minute there.
Oh, I think thank you for having the time to and having the interest in I guess this bill is probably like you say, it's hard to know how it will affect people who are not from trans or intersex or other kind of related communities, but I appreciate possibly could be end up with things like greater policing in places, segregated spaces, but I think that what we're hearing is these are massive issues for our communities, for all of the areas, for all the reasons that I've talked about. So, I appreciate you being willing to kind of help share the concern, even if this bill doesn't pass, it seems like there are some real concerns with how well it was drafted, like you've talked to. I think we are seeing a broader political movement in a certain direction. So I think it will be important to, not be complacent, I suppose, and keep listening to and getting to know other trans people in your lives, I guess, out there to understand these issues, because we're the ones who are most affected by it.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much for coming along today, Dr. Jaimie Veale. Remember, those submissions are due in by the 2nd of July, but don't leave it to the last minute, anytime before 11:59. And I am out. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the OI Podcast, the shout-out for the arts, sciences and mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI Podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.